You're all coming with me. Ma'am, do you have any idea where you just walked into?
Step away from the table.
You just walked into an active criminal investigation.
My front door hit the wall with a sickening crack. "I have you on camera operating an illegal business," Brenda screeched, waving her iPad. She didn't even notice the 4 armed state investigators or the state attorney general sitting at my dining table, and she'd just committed a federal felony. There is a specific kind of peace that belongs only to an old lake cabin in the early morning. The water looks like dark glass, the loons are just starting to call, and the smell of old pine and damp earth fills your lungs. That peace was exactly why my grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, bought 3 acres on the edge of Lake Oakhaven back in 1974. He built a beautiful, sturdy A-frame cedar cabin with his own 2 hands, long before the surrounding area was developed into a manicured, cookie-cutter suburbia. When my grandfather passed away 2 years ago, he left the property to me. I'm a software developer. I work remotely, I keep to myself, and I wanted nothing more than to preserve the quiet sanctuary he had created. Unfortunately, I inherited the cabin, but I also inherited a war. In 1998, a massive developer bought the surrounding 400 acres of forest and built Oakhaven Shores, a luxury gated community. They formed an aggressively litigious homeowners association. My grandfather, being a stubborn Korean War veteran with an ironclad property deed, flat out refused to join. After years of legal battles, a judge ruled in my grandfather's favor, granting him a grandfathered exemption, often called a pioneer clause. Our property was technically within the gates of the community, and we had an easement to use their roads, but the HOA had exactly 0 legal authority over my cabin. Enter Brenda Carmichael. Brenda was the president of the Oakhaven Shores HOA. She was a woman who treated her unpaid neighborhood position like she had just been elected Supreme Chancellor of the Milky Way. She drove a lifted golf cart with a flashing amber light on the roof, wore crisp white tennis visors even in November, and had perfectly sprayed blonde hair that seemed structurally engineered to withstand a hurricane. To Brenda, my grandfather's rustic cedar cabin was an eyesore. It didn't match the Nantucket gray aesthetic of the $900,000 McMansions surrounding the lake. Worse, my very existence was an affront to her power. She couldn't find me. She couldn't tell me what color to paint my mailbox. It drove her absolutely insane. When I moved in, Brenda immediately tested the waters. Within my first week, I found a pink notice of infraction taped to my door. The violation? Improperly stored recreational vessel. I had left my grandfather's vintage green canoe tied to my own private dock. I called the number on the notice. "Hi, Brenda," I said, trying to be neighborly. "This is David Mitchell at the old A-frame. I think there's been a mistake. My property isn't subject to HOA bylaws." "Mr. Mitchell," Brenda's voice dripped with condescension, "the pioneer clause applied to your grandfather. It does not transfer to new ownership. You are now part of Oakhaven Shores. The fine is $200, and you have 48 hours to remove that hideous boat before we confiscate it." She was bluffing, and we both knew it. Property deeds don't magically rewrite themselves upon inheritance. I didn't argue. I just hired my grandfather's old property lawyer, Daniel Ross, to send her a formal cease and desist letter, complete with a copy of the deed and the 1,998 court ruling. That was my first mistake. You don't use logic on an HOA Karen. To Brenda, a legal boundary wasn't a stop sign. It was a declaration of war. Over the next 8 months, Brenda made it her life's mission to break me. She sent notices for having unauthorized flora because I let native Michigan wildflowers grow in my front yard instead of Kentucky bluegrass. She tried to have my internet service line cut, claiming the provider truck was illegally parked on the community road. She even hired Gary Stubbs, a retired mechanic, who acted as her personal enforcer to measure the distance between my trash cans and the curb. The fines piled up in my mailbox, eventually totaling over $8,500. I threw every single one of them directly into my fireplace. Legally, she was a ghost screaming at a brick wall. But practically, she was a nightmare. She started lingering at the edge of my property line in her golf cart, holding a pair of Bushnell binoculars, just watching my house. I caught her twice taking photos of my guests' license plates when I had friends over for a barbecue. She began spreading rumors on the neighborhood Facebook group that I was running a methane lab. She meant meth, but chemistry wasn't her strong suit because of the smoke from my chimney. I tried to ignore her. I installed security cameras, upgraded my locks, and focused on my code. I thought the worst she could do was be a nuisance. I had no idea how spectacularly she was about to ruin her own life. The catalyst for Brenda's downfall didn't start in Oak Haven Shores. It started in the state capitol, with a phone call from my oldest college friend, James Holden. James and I had shared a tiny dorm room at the University of Michigan. While I went into tech, James went into politics. He was brilliant, ruthless in a debate, and incredibly loyal. By his late 30s, he had climbed the political ladder to become the chief of staff for the state attorney general, William Bill Rutherford. A.G. Rutherford was a legend in legal circles. He was a former federal prosecutor who had built his career taking down organized crime syndicates. He was a massive, imposing man with silver hair and a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Recently, his office had quietly opened a massive RICO, racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations investigation. "David, I need a massive favor," James said when he called me on a Tuesday evening in late October. He sounded exhausted. "Name it," I replied, pulling a frozen pizza out of the oven. "The boss is running a highly sensitive, off-the-books investigation," James explained, his voice dropping an octave. "We're looking into a massive real estate fraud ring, corrupt property management companies, shell LLCs, and dirty judges. They're using fake HOA liens to illegally foreclose on elderly people's homes, buying them for pennies at auction, and flipping them. It's a multi-million-dollar racket." "That sounds terrifying. What do you need from me?" "We have a whistleblower," James said, "a forensic accountant from inside the syndicate. He's terrified for his life and refuses to meet at the state capitol. He thinks there are leaks in our cybercrimes division. We need a completely isolated, secure location to meet him this weekend. No government Wi-Fi, no state-owned buildings, no paper trails, just a quiet house in the woods." "You still out at the lake cabin?" I looked around my quiet living room. "Yeah, I am. Can we borrow it from Friday night to Sunday? We'll bring our own security, our own servers. You don't have to leave if you don't want to, but we need total privacy." "Of course," I said without hesitation. "It's gated, which is annoying for me, but it keeps random traffic out. It's perfectly safe." "You're a lifesaver, David. The AG owes you one." On Friday evening, the atmosphere at Oak Haven Shores shifted dramatically. Just after dusk, a convoy of 3 nondescript black Chevy Suburbans pulled up to the gated entrance. I had already called the guardhouse to authorize my guests, but the sheer size of the vehicles definitely turned heads. They rolled slowly down the winding suburban streets, finally crunching onto my long gravel driveway. Out stepped James, looking stressed in an unbuttoned suit, followed by 4 men in plain clothes, windbreakers, and jeans who carried themselves with the rigid, hyper-aware posture of highly trained law enforcement. These were state troopers from the Executive Protection Detail. They immediately fanned out, securing the perimeter of the cabin. Finally, Attorney General Bill Rutherford stepped out of the middle SUV, carrying a battered leather briefcase. He shook my hand warmly. "Mr. Mitchell, I can't thank you enough for your hospitality. Your grandfather built a beautiful home." "Welcome to the lake, sir," I said. Shortly after, another car arrived carrying Sarah Jenkins, a razor-sharp federal prosecutor who was partnering with the state on the case, and a nervous-looking man in a trench coat clutching a hard drive to his chest like a baby the whistleblower. Within an hour, my rustic living room was transformed into a subterranean command center. The troopers brought in heavy Pelican cases containing encrypted laptops, satellite uplinks, and massive rolling whiteboards. The coffee maker was working overtime. Documents were spread across my dining table, detailing bank wire transfers, fake shell companies, and foreclosure notices. I stayed out of their way, mostly retreating to my upstairs loft to do my own work, occasionally coming down to refill the coffee pot or offer snacks. But out in the dark, beyond the pine trees, a storm was brewing. Brenda Carmichael had seen the black SUVs. To a normal person, 3 identical black SUVs driven by men with earpieces screams, government or security. To Brenda, whose brain was entirely consumed by neighborhood gossip and HOA bylaws, it screamed, illegal commercial operation. At 9:45 p.m. my phone buzzed. It was a text from Brenda. I see the vehicles, David. I know exactly what you are doing. Oak Haven Shores Bylaw 4.2.1 strictly prohibits the operation of commercial bed and breakfasts, corporate retreat centers, or illicit boarding houses. You are putting the entire community at risk. I rolled my eyes and ignored it. 10 minutes later, another text. I demand you disperse your guests immediately. I have contacted the board. We are drafting an emergency lien on your property for unapproved commercial zoning violations. I showed the text to James, who was pouring himself a mug of black coffee in the kitchen. He let out a tired laugh. Who is this? The HOA president, I sighed. She's been harassing me for months. Thinks my grandfather's pioneer clause is void. Don't worry about it. She's all bark. HOAs, James muttered, shaking his head. Half the reason we're running this investigation is because of people like her, little tyrants with too much power. I silenced my phone and went to bed, assuming Brenda would just stew in her own rage until Monday. I vastly underestimated the delusion of a woman who had never been told no in her life. Saturday morning broke cold and overcast. The tension inside the cabin was palpable. The whistleblower had spent the entire night talking, and the whiteboards in my living room were now covered in highly classified, sensitive information. There were names of sitting state judges, routing numbers for offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, and detailed flowcharts mapping out how the criminal syndicate laundered their money through landscaping companies. A.G. Rutherford had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He was pacing the floor, tracing a line on the whiteboard with a red marker. So they force the foreclosure. The Shell LLC buys the debt, and the property management company sweeps the asset, the AG growled, his voice a low rumble. It's brilliant, and it's absolutely disgusting. Federal prosecutor Sarah Jenkins was typing furiously on an encrypted laptop. If we can link this account to the fraudulent deed transfer in Macomb County, we have the predicate for a federal RICO charge. We can seize everything. I was in the kitchen, quietly flipping bacon in a cast-iron skillet, trying to be a good host while pretending I wasn't listening to the biggest legal takedown in state history. Outside, the security detail had established a subtle routine. 2 troopers were stationed inside the cabin by the front and back doors. 2 others were doing a roving perimeter check in the woods. What we didn't know was that Brenda had mobilized. At 8:30 a.m., Gary Stubbs, Brenda's loyal HOA handyman, pulled his pickup truck to the edge of my gravel driveway. He intentionally parked in a way that blocked the road, then popped his hood, pretending his truck had stalled. One of the plainclothes troopers, a tall, broad-shouldered guy named Agent Miller, walked down the driveway to investigate the blocked access route. "Everything okay here, sir?" I heard Miller ask through the open kitchen window. "Yeah, just an alternator issue," Gary stalled, leaning under the hood. It was a distraction, a surprisingly effective, albeit completely accidental, tactical diversion. While Agent Miller was dealing with Gary at the front of the property, Brenda Carmichael was marching through the damp woods behind my cabin. She was wearing a pastel pink velour tracksuit and her signature white visor. She marched past my no trespassing signs, past the property markers, and marched right up the wooden steps of my back deck. Years ago, before my grandfather fortified the cabin, the old HOA board had somehow convinced him to give them a spare key, strictly for emergency gas meter checks. He had changed the locks a decade ago, but he kept the back door deadbolt the same because it was an antique brass fitting. Brenda, an obsessive archivist of HOA power, still had that key on her massive, jangling keyring. Inside, I was transferring the bacon to a plate. A.G. Rutherford was standing in the center of the living room, his arms crossed, staring intently at the whiteboard filled with classified data. Sarah Jenkins was on a secure phone line to a federal judge, securing an emergency subpoena. Then I heard it, a metallic clack-click from the back door. My blood ran cold. The back door opened directly into the living room. Before I could even shout a warning, the heavy wooden door was kicked inward. It didn't just open, it flew open, hitting the drywall with a violent, sickening crack that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. "Gotcha!" A shrill voice pierced the air. Brenda Carmichael burst into the room. She was holding her iPad out in front of her like a shield, the camera flash going off like a strobe light. Flash, flash, flash. The room froze in a split second of absolute, terrifying silence. The reaction from the state troopers was instantaneous and visceral. The trooper stationed near the hallway moved with terrifying speed, his hand dropping directly to the Glock 19 holstered at his hip, his body shifting into a combat stance. Agent Miller, who had just stepped back onto the porch behind Brenda, shoved past her, his hand also on his weapon. "Hands! Let me see your hands!" Miller roared, a command that shook the windows. Brenda shrieked, dropping her iPad, but she didn't retreat. She was so blinded by her own self-righteous fury that she didn't process the lethal danger she had just walked into. She didn't see highly trained law enforcement officers. She saw David Mitchell's illegal business partners. "Don't you yell at me!" Brenda screamed, wagging a manicured finger at the heavily armed trooper. "I am executing a summary eviction based on HOA emergency powers. I have you all on camera. Operating an illegal corporate retreat. Bylaw 4.2. A.G. Rutherford stood perfectly still. He slowly turned his massive frame to look at this woman in a pink tracksuit, screaming in the middle of his classified command center. His eyes flicked to the iPad on the floor, which had landed face up, still displaying a crystal-clear photo it had just taken of the highly classified whiteboard detailing the RICO investigation. "David," James Holden said, his voice terrifyingly calm, stepping out from the shadows of the hallway. "Who is this?" I stepped out of the kitchen, holding a pair of metal tongs, completely dumbfounded. "That is Brenda, the HOA president." Brenda puffed out her chest, completely ignoring the guns, the earpieces, and the grave danger. "That's right. And I have caught you red-handed, David. I have the photos. Look at this." She gestured wildly at the whiteboards. "Flow charts? Organizational structures? This is clearly a commercial enterprise. I am calling the sheriff, and every single one of you is going to pack your bags and leave Oak Haven Shores immediately." Sarah Jenkins, the federal prosecutor, slowly lowered her cell phone from her ear. She looked at Brenda, then looked at the AG. "Bill, did she just photograph the protected informant matrix?" "Yes, Sarah, I believe she did," Rutherford replied. His voice was no longer the friendly tone of a guest. It was the chilling, absolute zero tone of a career prosecutor who was about to dismantle a life. Brenda scoffed, placing her hands on her hips. "I don't care what kind of matrix you people are selling. You have 5 minutes to vacate the premises before I have your vehicles towed." A.G. Rutherford took a slow, deliberate step forward. He looked down at Brenda. The sheer difference in their presence was staggering. Brenda was running on suburban entitlement, but the man standing in front of her wielded the actual power of the state. "Ma'am," Rutherford said softly, "do you have any idea what you have just done?" Brenda Carmichael planted her hands firmly on her pastel pink hips, completely unfazed by the two state troopers whose hands were still resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. In her mind, she wasn't trespassing. She was executing a righteous crusade on behalf of the Oak Haven Shores Homeowners Association. "I know exactly what I've done," Brenda sneered, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "I have caught a resident operating an unauthorized, unzoned commercial enterprise. The bylaws are very clear, sir. And frankly, your aggressive posture is a violation of community guidelines. I will be adding a harassment surcharge to Mr. Mitchell's account." Attorney General William Rutherford didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply let out a slow, measured breath. The terrifying calm of a man who routinely locked away cartel bosses settled over the room. "Ma'am," Rutherford began, his voice dropping to a gravelly, authoritative register that commanded absolute silence. "You have just committed felony breaking and entering. You have forcibly breached a secured location. Furthermore, you have photographed classified state and federal intelligence pertaining to an active, sealed grand jury investigation." Brenda rolled her eyes dramatically, adjusting the white tennis visor on her head. "Oh, please, classified intelligence. You, do, you, do, I know a corporate retreat when I see one. You people are probably running a timeshare scam. Now, pick up your little whiteboards and get off my lake." James Holden stepped forward, holding up his official state credentials. "Mrs. Carmichael, I am the Chief of Staff for the State Attorney General's office. The man you are currently shouting at is Attorney General William Rutherford. The woman to his left is Federal Prosecutor Sarah Jenkins. You are currently standing in the middle of a joint state and federal RICO command center." For a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Brenda's aggressively tanned face. Her eyes darted from the gold seal on James's badge to the heavy tactical belts worn by the troopers, and finally to the massive, unsmiling figure of the Attorney General. But true HOA Karens do not retreat. They double down. "I don't care if you're the Pope," Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking as panic began to war with her ego. "State law does not supersede the Oak Haven Shores covenants, conditions, and restrictions. We have a gated perimeter. You did not submit a guest authorization form. You are trespassing on private community property, and I demand you leave." Agent Miller, the broad-shouldered trooper, looked at Rutherford. The AG simply gave a microscopic nod. "Brenda Carmichael," Agent Miller said, his voice ringing out with military precision as he unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest." "Excuse me," Brenda gasped, stumbling backward as Miller closed the distance in two massive strides. "You can't arrest me. I'm the president of the board. I have immunity from civil prosecution regarding community affairs." "This isn't a civil matter, Brenda," Miller replied coldly, grabbing her wrist with a practiced, inescapable grip. He spun her around, pressing her gently but firmly against the cedar wall of my cabin. The sound of the ratcheting steel cuffs locking around her wrists echoed through the room. Click, click, click. "Hey, stop it. You're wrinkling my tracksuit." "I'm calling the police," she wailed, thrashing her shoulders. "We are the police, ma'am," Miller replied dryly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Miller read her Miranda rights, Sarah Jenkins walked over and carefully picked up Brenda's iPad from the floor. She tapped the screen to keep it from locking. "Bill," Sarah called out, her eyes scanning the photograph Brenda had just taken. She got the whole matrix. The informant's name, the shell companies, the Cayman routing numbers. "It's a crystal clear shot." Rutherford's jaw tightened. He walked over to Brenda, who was now hyperventilating as Agent Miller held her by the arms. "Mrs. Carmichael," Rutherford said softly, "by photographing that board, You have jeopardized a multi-million-dollar federal investigation and directly threatened the life of a protected witness. You aren't just facing breaking and entering charges anymore. You are looking at federal obstruction of justice and potentially espionage under the broad statutes of interfering with a federal RICO probe. The blood completely drained from Brenda's face. The sheer weight of the words federal obstruction, espionage, RICO finally shattered her suburban delusion. The tyrannical HOA president, who had spent a decade terrorizing people over trash cans and mailbox paint, began to sob hysterically. "It was just a bylaw check," she wept, her mascara running down her face. "He had a canoe. He didn't mow the wildflowers. I was just enforcing the rules." "Take her outside and put her in the secure vehicle," Rutherford ordered, turning his back on her in disgust. "Confiscate her phone, her keys, and this iPad. Do not let her speak to anyone. We need to assess the damage." As Brenda was marched out of my grandfather's cabin in handcuffs, wailing about her neighborhood authority, I stood in the kitchen holding my tongs, completely speechless. But the real twist of the morning hadn't even revealed itself yet. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from high-stakes tension to frantic damage control. Agent Miller marched Brenda down the gravel driveway, her neon-pink tracksuit a stark contrast against the dark tactical gear of the state troopers. Out on the main road, Gary Stubbs, Brenda's loyal handyman, was still pretending to tinker with his truck's alternator. When he saw his boss being escorted in steel bracelets, he froze, slowly dropped his wrench, and immediately put his hands in the air, surrendering without a single word being spoken to him. Back inside, Sarah Jenkins had plugged Brenda's confiscated iPad into one of the encrypted laptops. She needed to ensure the photo of the classified whiteboard hadn't automatically backed up to a cloud server where the syndicate's hackers might access it. The nervous whistleblower, who had been hiding in the hallway during the breach, timidly stepped back into the living room. He adjusted his glasses and peered over Sarah's shoulder at the iPad screen. "Did she send it?" Rutherford asked, pouring himself another cup of coffee, looking incredibly tired. "No, thank God," Sarah sighed in relief. "She didn't have time. The photo is localized, and I'm wiping the device's cloud sync right now." As Sarah was navigating through the iPad settings, she swiped past Brenda's open applications. There was the camera app, a neighborhood gossip Facebook group, and an email application open to a specific financial dashboard. The whistleblower gasped. He pointed a trembling finger at the iPad screen. "Wait. Stop. Go back to that email." Sarah frowned, but swiped back to the open email application. It was an official communication from the Oak Haven Shores Homeowners Association Treasury. It detailed the transfer of neighborhood reserve funds and legal penalty collections. "What is it?" James Holden asked, stepping closer to the screen. The whistleblower looked at the Attorney General, his eyes wide with absolute shock. "That routing number and the payee, Apex Property Solutions." Rutherford set his coffee mug down so hard the hot liquid splashed over the rim. He marched over to the massive whiteboard and pointed to the second tier of the criminal organizational chart. Right there, written in red marker, was the name, Apex Property Solutions. "Are you telling me," Rutherford said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "that this woman's homeowners association is tied to our target?" The whistleblower nodded frantically. "Apex is one of the primary shell companies the syndicate uses to launder money and seize real estate. We knew they were using fraudulent HOA liens in several counties to foreclose on homes, but we didn't know which specific neighborhoods were acting as the feeder networks." Sarah began typing furiously, cross-referencing the financial data on Brenda's iPad with the federal database. Within 10 minutes, the terrifying reality of Brenda Carmichael's reign of terror became entirely clear. Brenda wasn't just an overzealous neighbor. She was an unwitting, or perhaps entirely willing pawn in a massive organized crime ring. Here is how the scam worked. For years, Brenda had been issuing exorbitant, ridiculous fines to the residents of Oak Haven Shores. Unapproved paint colors, slightly tall grass, parking a contractor's van in a driveway for too long. When residents refused or failed to pay these inflated fines, Brenda's HOA board would place a lien on their properties. Eventually, the HOA would move to foreclose on the home to collect the debt. But instead of selling the houses on the open market, Brenda was quietly routing the foreclosed properties to a preferred management vendor, Apex Property Solutions. Apex would buy the luxury homes for pennies on the dollar at private auctions, then flip them for massive profits, funneling the laundered cash straight to the syndicate bosses. Brenda was feeding her own neighbors to a criminal enterprise, all under the guise of maintaining property values. "Look at this," Sarah said, bringing up a spreadsheet from Brenda's email. She transferred over $140,000 in collected legal fees and penalty reserves directly into Apex's offshore accounts just this year. She's been essentially acting as a collection agent for the mob. Rutherford let out a dark, humorless laugh. "She broke in here to bust us for a zoning violation and ended up hand-delivering the final piece of financial evidence we needed to link the street-level fraud to the corporate shell companies." The Attorney General turned to look at me. I was still standing near the kitchen island, trying to process the fact that my annoying neighbor was a cog in a RICO syndicate. "Mitchell," Rutherford smiled, a genuine, terrifying shark smile. "Your grandfather built a fortress. And thanks to his pioneer clause, your property was the only one in this entire zip code they couldn't touch. That's why she hated you so much. You were a blind spot in her laundering machine." Later that afternoon, the operation shifted gears entirely. The command center didn't just stay the weekend, it expanded. State warrants were quietly issued. While Brenda was sitting in a holding cell at the county lockup, completely isolated from the outside world, a fleet of federal agents raided the Oak Haven Shores HOA clubhouse. They seized file cabinets, hard drives, and ledgers. They found exactly what they were looking for: years of fraudulent liens, illegal foreclosures, and kickback receipts, tying Brenda directly to the Apex Shell Company. She had been receiving consulting bonuses under the table for every house she successfully foreclosed on. She wasn't just a Karen. She was a white-collar criminal wrapped in a pink velour tracksuit. The fallout wasn't just a local scandal. It was a media earthquake. On Monday morning, the state capitol press briefing room was packed wall to wall with reporters, glaring camera lights, and hushed, nervous whispers. Attorney General William Rutherford stepped up to the polished oak podium, adjusting the microphones with the heavy, deliberate movements of a man about to drop a bomb. He officially announced the unsealing of a massive, multi-state racketeering indictment, naming 42 individuals involved in the real estate syndicate. Right there, on the third page of the federal document, was Brenda Carmichael. The list of charges beneath her name read like a career criminal's rap sheet: federal racketeering, wire fraud, grand theft, embezzlement, extortion, and felony obstruction of justice. When the local news stations broadcasted her mugshot, her perfectly sprayed blonde hair now flat, her mascara smudged, still wearing the pastel pink velour tracksuit from Saturday morning, the affluent community of Oak Haven Shores practically imploded. The neighborhood Facebook group, once a heavily moderated echo chamber where Brenda posted passive-aggressive warnings about grass height and unapproved holiday decorations, devolved into a digital riot. Residents, who had lived in perpetual fear of her arbitrary fines and tyrannical golf cart patrols, suddenly realized they hadn't just been bullied, they had been robbed blind. Elderly couples realized exactly why they had almost lost their homes over trivial painting infractions. Even her husband, Harold Carmichael, who had spent years silently enjoying the kickback money while turning a blind eye to her tyrannical reign, couldn't handle the heat. 2 days after the arrest, a fleet of moving trucks was spotted at their Nantucket Gray McMansion. Harold packed up his golf clubs and fled to a condo in Florida, filing for divorce and leaving Brenda to face the federal music entirely alone. 2 weeks later, I was subpoenaed to testify at her preliminary hearing. The federal courtroom in downtown Detroit was standing room only, I sat in the polished wooden witness box, looking across the vast room at the defense table. Brenda was there, but she was entirely unrecognizable as the woman who had terrorized my property. The crisp white tennis visor was gone. She wore a drab, oversized khaki county jumpsuit. Her shoulders were slumped, and she looked incredibly small, deflated, and utterly terrified. The prosecution, led by federal prosecutor Sarah Jenkins, was merciless. They played the high-definition security footage from my cabin's back porch, the undeniable, crystal-clear video of Brenda violently kicking my antique brass door inward. They presented the photograph she had taken on her iPad, highlighting the classified informant matrix. Brenda's high-priced defense attorney, a slick guy in a tailored suit, desperately tried to argue that she was a victim of manipulation. He claimed she was just a dedicated community volunteer who had been tricked by the Apex Management Company, completely unaware that they were a criminal enterprise. But Sarah Jenkins meticulously laid out the devastating paper trail. She projected Brenda's private emails onto the courtroom monitors, highlighting the direct correspondence between Brenda and the syndicate bosses. The emails proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brenda knew exactly what she was doing. She had actively negotiated her under-the-table consulting bonuses for every house she successfully forced into foreclosure. She didn't care that lives were being ruined. She loved the power, and she loved the money. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of the federal RICO charges, plus the undeniable footage of her breaching a state-secured command center, Brenda's legal defense utterly collapsed. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero patience for white-collar theft, made it clear that if Brenda took this to a jury, she would ensure a maximum sentence. To avoid spending the rest of her natural life in a federal penitentiary, Brenda took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of federal extortion, wire fraud, and 1 count of felony breaking and entering. She was sentenced to 8 years in a federal minimum security facility, ordered to pay over $400,000 in direct restitution to the neighbors she had wrongfully foreclosed on, and permanently barred from ever holding a fiduciary position or serving on a community board for the rest of her life. But the poetic justice of the situation didn't stop with her incarceration. Because the Oakhaven Shores Homeowners Association had been officially classified in federal court as a vehicle for a criminal enterprise, a judge ordered the immediate, permanent dissolution of the HOA's charter. The corporation was entirely dismantled. The heavy iron community gates were locked in the open position, the ridiculous, suffocating bylaws were voided, and the neighborhood zoning was returned to the jurisdiction of the Standard County Municipality. The residents threw a massive, catered block party the weekend the HOA was officially dissolved. They set up a massive bonfire in the community cul-de-sac and actually burned copies of the neighborhood rulebook. They even invited me. I walked down the street, no longer the stubborn outcast hiding in the rustic cedar cabin, but the guy who inadvertently brought down the wicked witch of the neighborhood. Neighbors I had never spoken to were handing me beers and clapping me on the back. As for Gary Stubbs, the loyal handyman, he flipped on Brenda the second the state troopers put him in the back of a squad car on my driveway. He testified against her in exchange for full immunity, admitting he knew she was pocketing neighborhood money but was too scared of her vindictive nature to say anything. Ashamed and ostracized by the community, he quietly packed up his truck and moved to Ohio shortly after the trial concluded. 3 months later, absolute peace finally returned to Lake Oakhaven. I sat out on the back deck of my grandfather's A-frame cabin, holding a hot, steaming mug of dark roast coffee. The early morning mist was rolling gently off the dark, glass-like surface of the lake. The loons were calling to each other in the far distance, a haunting, beautiful sound that echoed through the trees. The crisp morning air smelled of old pine, damp earth, and absolute freedom. There were no flashing amber lights from a lifted golf cart patrolling my property line. There were no bright pink violation notices aggressively taped to my front door. There was no one holding binoculars, trying to measure the exact distance from my trash cans to the curb. My grandfather's vintage green canoe was tied tightly to the dock, right where it belonged. The native Michigan wildflowers were growing tall, vibrant, and completely untamed in the front yard. I had finally achieved the quiet sanctuary I had been seeking, proving once and for all that a solid property deed, a stubborn pioneer clause, and a little bit of accidental state intervention can conquer even the most tyrannical suburban dictator. The cabin was safe, and the only rules out here were the ones made by the woods. If you loved hearing this entitled HOA President get exactly what she deserved, hit that like button right now. Have you ever dealt with a tyrannical neighborhood Karen who thought she was above the law? Drop your wildest HOA horror stories in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life revenge stories and dramatic daily content. See you in the next video.